Hello everyone, this is Mr. Underkoffler. Today we're looking at the guided notes called Solving Multi-Step Equations. Follow along with me here as I read this out loud. It says the big idea, when possible, simplify before you solve. Now what exactly does that mean? Well, look for parentheses sections today because it is possible that you can use the distributive property if there is a multiplier outside of the parentheses and there is addition or subtraction on the inside. If you have like terms on the same side, like on one side of the equation, then you can go ahead and add them together. Simplify that part as well. These steps should be done before you're trying to get the variable to go from both sides to just one side. Let me show you some examples here. Problem number 1. You can see we had a distributive property section right here, so I took 4 times y and 4 times 9. I did that first before I tried to get the variable to disappear from this side by adding the opposite of the variable term, like we had practiced on the previous guided notes. So we did the distributive property first before we tried to get the variable to go to one side. Problem number 2. Again, there's a distributive property section on the right, so I take 2 times 7, 2 times g. This problem is unique because unlike number 1, where we had the variable on both sides, and so I tried to eliminate it from the left side by adding the opposite to get a 0, on problem number 2, the variable is only on the right side. So I skipped the work of trying to get the variable to go from both sides to one side if it's already on one side. So from that point, I say to myself, what's happening to the variable? And I know it's being multiplied, then being subtracted, so I add on both sides, and later I divide. So I go to inverse operations right away if the variable was already on one side. But again, we're going to look for places where we can simplify before we solve. So get your pencils in your hand, and let's do problem number 3 together. Hopefully you recognize this section here is definitely needing the distributive property. So we will take negative 14 times 3x. Use your calculator if you need to. That is negative 42x. Negative 14 times 5 is negative 70. We bring the plus down. Equal sign, and then 168 is obviously 168. And on problem number 3, just like on problem number 2, the variable is only on one side. So we don't need to add the opposite of the variable term to try to eliminate it from the side. It is only on this side. So what's happening to the variable? Well, it's being multiplied by negative 42, and then it's being added by negative 70. The inverse of adding by negative 70 is subtracting by negative 70. Now, we're not going to leave it like that. We're going to make it adding the opposite. In fact, while we're at it, we might as well just go ahead and put adding positive 70 on the right, since that's the same thing as subtracting a negative. So instead of wasting my time and putting minus a negative, I'm just going to make it adding a positive right away. And the more you get used to this, the more you're just going to, by instinct, jump right to adding by positive 70, because you know a negative 70 plus a positive 70 will give you 0. So what does that leave us with? Negative 42x, bring it down, equals 168 plus 70 is 238. The inverse of multiplying by negative 42 is dividing by negative 42. Do not lose the negative sign. We do not inverse the sign of the number. We only inverse the operation from multiplication, inversing to division. Use your calculator, because this is not something you're probably going to do without one. 238 divided by negative 42 is negative 5.6 repeating. Your calculator probably actually put a 7 on the far right end. If your calculator did that, it's just rounding at the end. Ignore that. This is a repeating 6. You could also write the answer as negative 5 2/3, a mixed number, if you would like. Okay, let's do one more together, because this one's going to have the variable on both sides. So I would like to do one of those together. So first things first, do you see what I see? Oh, we got the distributive property section over here on the right. So we're going to take the multiplier and distribute it to the 5n and the 12. Write it down with me. So 4 times 5n is 20n. Bring down the minus. 4 times 12 is 48. And then the left side's going to stay the way it was. Okay. I've given you advice in the past that if the variable term is to the right of the minus, it's very helpful to make it adding the opposite before you go any further. So I would do that here, since the variable term was to the right of the minus both sides of the equation, I'm going to make that adding negative. Okay. Now, which place do you want to get the variable to eliminate so that way it ends up on just one side? I would like to advise that you do it the way where you get a positive coefficient of the variable. So I either add by positive 3n, because that's the opposite of negative 3n, or I add by positive 20n, because that's the opposite of negative 20n. Well, if you add by positive 20n, negative 3n and positive 20n will give you positive 17n. And my advice is try to get the positive coefficient way of doing it. Yeah, you could do it the other way. You could add by positive 3n on both sides, but then you would get a negative 17n on the right. And it's just a little bit nicer to have positives instead of negatives. Okay, let's ask ourselves what's happened to the variable now. It's being multiplied by 17, then added by 184. Let's go in the reverse order of operations and get rid of the addition. Inverse is to subtract on both sides. You could make this adding the opposite if you want, but you're probably going to use the calculator. 48 take away 184 is negative 136. Again, if you want to make it adding the opposite, you may. And then the inverse of multiplying by 17 is dividing by 17, and use your calculator again. You should get negative 8. Okay. Number 5 is already typed up for you. Remember, if you got a variable term to the right of minus, you should probably make it adding the opposite right away. You can go ahead and do that with your pencil. I did do it underneath. We had a distributive property section over here on the right, so 3 times 2w, 3 times 6, nothing new. We were just practicing that in the past two problems. But check this out. The left side had like terms both on the left side of the equal sign. Notice I didn't highlight the 6w. The 6w is on the other side of the equal sign. So I'm just looking for like terms that are both on the same side. And that's what I had here. Negative 12w, negative 4w. You can add them together and get negative 16w. So this is the idea. Simplify before you solve. This means completing all distributive property expressions and also adding any like terms that are on the same side of the equation. Again, please do not add something on the left to something that's on the right side of the equal sign. That's not what I mean by adding by like terms. I'm looking for like terms on the same side. So on number 4, you wouldn't add negative 3n to negative 20n because they're on different sides of the equal sign. But on number 5, negative 12w, negative 4w, they're both on the left side of the equal sign. And we do those steps, simplifying before we solve, before we try to get the variable to eliminate from one side, so that way it just ends up on one side. Do those simplifying steps first. Okay, so as you can see, I went ahead and I got the positive version over here. Instead of adding by negative 6w, which would have given me negative 22w on the left, I added by positive 16w to get positive 22w. Again, that's something I would advise my students to do. Eventually, I subtract, later divide. That's how it works. So, look for like terms if they are on the same side of the equal sign. Okay, problem number 6. Let's do this one together, and then you'll eventually do 7 and pretty much all the other problems on your own on the next page as well. So, as you can see, we have distributive property on the left, distributive property on the right. Let's start this. 3 times 4k is 12k. 3 times 14 is 42. So, left side, not a big deal. We used the distributive property. The right side, the 10k is not the multiplier to the parentheses, and it's not in the parentheses, so that's going to stay the way it was. But here's the deal. When you have subtraction to the left of your multiplier, which you're about to use for the distributive property, it can get a little tricky. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you The slow way of doing this, do not write this down. So put your pencil down and just watch me do it. 2 times k, 2 times 7, 2 times k is 2k, 2 times 7 is 14, but that's being subtracted away from 10k. Believe it or not, you would need parentheses since there was subtraction to the left. The parentheses still matter. And then you would add by the additive inverse of 2k plus 14. The additive inverse of 2k plus 14 is negative 2k minus 14. And then, yes, I most likely would make the subtraction become adding the opposite. Well, maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. But anyway, you would take it from there. That's the slow way. We can actually do this quicker if we make subtraction adding the opposite up here and then do the distributive property. So get your pencil in your hand. Let's do it the quicker way. Let's make this adding the opposite before we distribute it to the k and to the 7. So notice now we're distributing a negative 2. So this is going to give me negative 2k, and negative 2 times 7 is negative 14. You're like, is that really faster? Well, yes, it is. Look, the other way, it took me 2 separate steps to get that done. Here, I got it done in 1 step. So, moral of the story, like I told you, if you ever have a variable part to the right of minus, make it add in the opposite. Well, I'm telling you now, if you ever have a distributive property part to the right of minus, then make that minus adding a negative before you distribute it. That is going to be the quicker way of getting the job done. Okay, now that we've said that, can you find some like terms that we could add together? But they got to be on the same side of the equal sign. So don't you dare tell me 12k and 10k. No, they're on different sides of the equal sign. But 10k and negative 2k, they are both on the right side of the equal sign. And so we can go ahead and put those like terms together, positive plus a negative, subtract in your head, and that's going to give us 8k. We bring down to the plus negative 14, and the 12k minus 42, that's already there. From here, we can now try to eliminate the variable from one of the sides to get it to go from both sides to just one side. I recommend, instead of adding by negative 12k, I would add by negative 8k, because that's going to give you a positive 4k on the left. Think about it. If you would have added by negative 12k on both sides, then you would have got a negative 4k on the right instead of a positive 4k on the left. So I would rather get a positive 4k. I just find that to be easier. Okay, what else we got? Minus 42 equals, and we got the negative 14. All right, from here, I think you should know how to solve it. So hit pause now, finish solving this problem on your own, and then I would like for you to try number 7 on your own as well. But don't go any further than that for now. So finish 6, and then do all of 7. Let's see how you do. Hit pause now, do the rest of 6 and 7, then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. Okay, did you already finish 6 and do 7? If you did not, hit pause now. Because here we go. The inverse of, well, I'm not going to do the inverse of multiplication yet. Order of SADMAP, reverse order of operations. Start with the inverse of the addition or subtraction piece. Inverse of subtracting by 42 is adding by 42. That's going to give me 4k by itself, and over on the right side, you're going to get 28. Then you will divide by 4 on both sides, and you will get 7. If I went too fast, feel free to hit pause if you need to fix something. Problem number 7. Hopefully you saw the distributive property over here. 3 times n is 3n. 3 times 6 is 18. You brought down the 22. Equals, did you remember that n is the same as 1n? And that way you can combine it with the minus 8n. 1n take away 8n is negative 7n. If you made that adding the opposite, that would have been fine. You could have done that if you wanted to. I don't know if you really have to figure out that that's negative 7n. It's not like you had to use the commutative property here. So fine. And then we got the minus 3. Oh, speaking of like terms, on the left side, we have 2 constants. But notice, there's subtraction to the left of it. If you got 3n minus 40, no. You're like, why is that no? Because technically, you're not going left to right with addition and subtraction. You're actually trying to use the associative property, and you can't do that when there's minus. Now, I bet nobody's drawing parentheses today, but if there is minus to the left of a term, that is like having a negative term. You're like, why? Because subtraction is the same as adding, the opposite. So this actually gives you 3n plus 4. If you messed that up, it's a very common mistake. Hit pause, fix everything, because this is going to change your answers underneath. So you might need to do some work to fix your error. So hit pause if you need to and fix your work. Did you go ahead and do that already? Unless you didn't have to. From here, you need to get the variable to eliminate either from the left or eliminate from the right. If you're going to make it eliminate from the right, you would add by 7n. If you want to make it eliminate from the left, you would add by negative 3n, and I will show that other method on the next slide. So those of you who added by negative 3n, fast forward to where I get to the next slide and I show your way of getting this problem finished. But those of you who added by 7n, follow with me here. That's going to give you 10n, and that's kind of nice. You get a positive coefficient on your variable, though always the way I prefer doing. And then the inverse of adding by 4 is subtracting by 4. That's going to give you negative 7. If you don't believe me, I can quickly show you. If you make subtraction become adding the opposite, a negative plus a negative, you would add in your head, and that gives you negative 7. Okay, where was I? And the inverse of multiplying by 10 is dividing by 10. Negative 7 divided by 10 is negative 7/10, negative 0.7. As I promised, those of you who added by negative 3n, here's what you're going to get. You're going to get a negative 10n on the right. You'll have to add by 3, because that's the inverse of subtracting by 3, which will give you positive 7. But then you'll have to divide by a negative 10 on both sides. You will get the same answer. So as you can see, it doesn't matter if you added by 7n, you're going to get negative 0.7 at the end, or if you added by negative 3n, you're also going to get negative 0.7 at the end. So either way you do it should work. Okay, I want you to try the last 4 problems on your own. We got 8, 9, 10, and 11. Hit pause, take your time, do those 4 problems, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. Okay, did you already do 8, 9, 10, and 11? If not, hit pause now and do them. Here we go. You started with the distributive property. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times x is 3x. Since there's minus and the variable parts to the right of the minus, I would definitely make that add in the opposite very early in my work. Speaking of adding the opposite, you probably wanted to put together the like terms here, but there's a minus. And we know that subtraction is the same as adding the opposite, so I hope you did not get a 14x. This is really a negative 6x, so you're going to get 2x, because negative 6 and positive 8 makes 2. From here, I would personally want to add by positive 3x on both sides, eliminating the negative 3x from the left. That would give me 5x on the right. For those of you who did it the other way, I will once again show your version on the next slide. So if you added by negative 2x, fast forward to where I get to the next slide and I show you your method of finishing this problem. From here, inverse of adding by 71 is subtracting by 71, giving you negative 65. And the inverse of multiplying by 5 is dividing by 5, giving you the answer of negative 13. Feel free to hit pause if you need to make corrections or need to look at it a little bit longer. If you did it the other way, where you added by negative 2x, you'll get negative 5x on the left. Your variable eliminates from the right. Inverse of adding by 6 is subtracting by 6. That's going to give you 65. Inverse of multiplying by negative 5 is dividing by negative 5. I hope that's what you did if you had the negative 5x on the left. That's going to give you negative 13, which was the same answer that I had from the other way of doing this. Feel free to hit pause if you need to fix work or check things longer. Problem number 9, you did the distributive property, taking 2/3 times 27c and times 15. That's going to give you 18c and 10, bringing down the minus. The c is the same as 1c, which I'll need that coming up soon because 18c and 1c will make 19c. We still got minus 10. Okay, on the right. Oh, we have subtraction to the left of parentheses. Do you remember how to do this? You're going to add by the additive inverse. So instead of 6c, it's going to be negative 6c. And instead of being plus 72, it's going to be minus 72. Now, you could also make that plus negative 72, because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Speaking of which, since I would technically need to do the commutative property in my head to combine the constants of 14 and it's actually negative 72, then it was good that I made this adding the opposite. So that way I realize that this is going to give me negative 58. If you had 86, then you really should have made this minus 72 plus negative 72. So that way you would realize why it is negative 58. And if you now realize you goofed that part up, feel free to hit pause, fix whatever you work you got to fix. Okay. If you're good to go, let's keep going. I'm going to eliminate the variable from the right side, so I'm going to add my positive 6c on both sides, give me 25c. I like having a positive coefficient, 25c minus 10. For those of you who did it the other way, where you added by negative 19c, I will show that on the next slide. Feel free to fast forward to that part if you did it that alternate way. Inverse of subtracting by 10 is adding by 10. That's going to give you negative 48. Inverse of multiplying by 25 is dividing by 25. And yes, you're going to get a decimal, negative 1.92. We can handle decimals, not that big of a deal. For those of you who did it the other way, where you added by negative 19c, you're going to get negative 25c. Then the inverse of adding by negative 58 is subtracting by negative 58. Now that's messy looking. I'd rather make that adding a positive, because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Negative 58 and positive 58 will give me 0. So I might as well just go ahead and add my positive 58 on the left, like I did here. And that's going to give me positive 48, but I got a negative on the 25c, so I'm going to have to divide by negative 25 on both sides. And that's also going to give me the answer of negative 1.92, the same answer I got from doing it the other way. Okay, problem number 10. You did the distributive property here and here. You should have got 2x minus 8, 3 plus 3x. I would recommend adding by negative 2x on both sides, giving me a positive 1x. But if you did it the other way, I feel like I'm a broken record here, guys. But I do have the other way shown on the next slide. So feel free to fast forward if you added by negative 3x and you want to see that way of doing it. Okay, watch out with this. I've seen so many kids mess up because they forget that that minus next to the 8 is like making this negative 8. In fact, I shouldn't have kept a little gap here between the minus and the 8. I should have just called it negative 8. You're like, well, why can you call it negative 8? Because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Now, do you have to make it adding the opposite? Well, you answer that for yourself. If you had a positive 8 here, then maybe you should have up here made it adding the opposite. I don't know. Or maybe you should just realize when there's a minus to the left of a number, that's like having a negative number. And you know why, because it's like adding a negative. Okay, so that might have messed you up if you didn't have the negative there. I'm going to subtract by 3, giving me negative 11, again, because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite of a negative plus a negative. I add in my head, I get negative 11. And then something's really cool about this. 1x. 1x means 1 times x. Please tell me you understand why that's significant. 1 times x is the same as x. You do not have to keep the 1 on it and divide by 1 on both sides. If you did divide by 1 on both sides, negative 11 divided by 1 is still negative 11. So really no need to do that. 1x is the same as x. All right, for those of you who did it the other way, you added by negative 3x on both sides, you're going to get negative 1x minus 8. You're going to have to add by 8 on both sides, giving you 11. You're going to have to divide by negative 1 on both sides, giving you negative 11. Okay, last problem, and this was probably the most complex one. We got a fraction multiplier. We had a negative w, which is like negative 1w. We also had minus to the left of parentheses here, so we're going to have a lot of stuff to do. Let's go ahead and start here with the left. Well, I guess I started with the right. Let's start with the right. 7/16 times 32w and times 128. Use your calculator, and you got 14w minus 56. And while I'm over here on the right, did you notice the like terms? You can add them together, get 13w minus 56. On the left, subtraction is the same as adding by the additive inverse of 23w plus 15, which makes it negative 23w minus 15. You could also call that plus negative 15 if you want. And you also have like terms, 21w, negative 23w, giving you negative 2w. From here, my recommendation, get a positive 15w on the right by adding by positive 2w, because a negative and a positive will give you the 0, eliminating the variable from that side. And like I keep saying every single time on all these problems, there will be an alternate way shown on the next slide. So those of you who added by negative 13w, I'll show you that on the next slide. Watch out. I mentioned this on the last problem. If you got a minus to the left of a number, that's going to make this negative 15 because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Do not lose that negative. So important to pay attention to those details. From here, the inverse of subtracting by 56 is adding by 56, giving you 41, and the inverse of multiplying by 15 is dividing by 15, giving you 2.73 repeating. You could also make that a mixed number. 2 and I forget how many 15ths it is. Maybe it's 11 15ths, something like that. Yeah, it is 2 and 11 15ths. So those of you who did it that way, mixed number, that would be fine. All right, those of you who added by negative 13w, here's your method. You'll get negative 15w on the left. Watch out for this minus. That was to the left of this 56. That's why this is negative 56, because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Inverse of subtracting by 15 is adding by 15. I got a negative 15w over here. I get negative 41. These are lots of negatives, ladies and gentlemen, if you did it this way. You're going to divide by, yep, there it is again, negative 15 on both sides. And a negative divided by negative is going to give you a positive. And that concludes the guided notes on solving multi-step equations. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.